There's a specific kind of silence that happens when a young man closes a door and doesn't open it again. Not the silence of someone who is fine. Not the silence of someone resting. The silence of someone who calculated the cost of being out there, ran the numbers without drama, and decided it wasn't worth it anymore. If you were born between 1996 and 2001, and you're a man, you know exactly what that silence sounds like. Either because you lived it, or because someone you knew went quiet, and then one day they just weren't around anymore. Here's what nobody says out loud. This isn't weakness. It isn't a generation of men who couldn't handle pressure. What researchers are now calling the early Gen Z male withdrawal pattern was built into the structure of your childhood long before you had any say in it. Picture this. It's 2009. You're 11 years old. The internet lives on a desktop in the living room, not in your pocket. Your social life happens at the park, at your friend's house down the street where you knocked on the door and waited. You had a neighborhood. You had a face. You had a version of yourself that existed before the algorithm knew your name. You had maybe 2 or 3 years of that, for if you were lucky. Then the smartphone arrived in your hands, and everything that used to live outside, your identity, your social hierarchy, your daily sense of whether you mattered, migrated online. And unlike older millennials who arrived at social media as adults with their personalities already formed, you were 13, 14, 15 when the full weight of it landed. That timing wasn't random, and it wasn't neutral. Psychologist Jean Twenge spent years tracking generational data, and what she found in the cohort that came of age between 2012 and 2018, exactly the window when early Gen Z hit adolescence, was unlike anything in the previous 5 decades. The number of teenagers who reported getting together with friends nearly every day dropped by more than 40% between 2007 and 2015. Mental health indicators for this cohort fell sharper and faster than any generation tracked before. What Twenge research made clear wasn't that a generation had developed a flaw. It was that the social infrastructure of adolescence had been quietly demolished. But for boys, something specific happened inside that larger collapse. When the social world moved online, it moved to a terrain built around performance, around image curation, around the constant maintenance of a digital self. Research consistently shows this kind of social performance maps more naturally onto the communication patterns that are stronger in adolescent girls: emotional disclosure, relational upkeep, managing impressions. For most young men, showing up online felt like arriving at a game where everyone else had been practicing for years and nobody gave you the rulebook. The feedback was immediate and unforgiving. And the alternative, not playing at all, cost nothing visible in the moment. So a lot of them stopped playing. Not dramatically, not with a speech. Slowly, the group chats got muted. The invitations got declined once, then twice, until they stopped coming. The friend group that had 10 people was down to 3, then 1, then there were no more group photos because there were no more groups. The social world didn't collapse in a single event. It contracted quietly until the perimeter of what felt manageable was just one room with a screen in it. This is what withdrawal looks like in real time. Not a breakdown, a slow subtraction. The 2023 American Perspective Survey from the Survey Center on American Life found that 15% of men under 30 reported having no close friends at all, a number that sat at 3% in 1990. Among Gen Z men specifically, a majority said they had no one they would call a best friend. Not a difficult year, not a rough patch, a baseline. In 2023, U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy issued a formal advisory on the loneliness epidemic in America, the kind his office normally reserves for tobacco or opioids. He described social disconnection as carrying mortality risks comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The group showing the steepest increase in loneliness wasn't elderly people living alone. It was young men in their early 20s. And then COVID happened. When the lockdowns arrived in March 2020, early Gen Z men were between 19 and 24 years old. Developmental psychologists call that window a critical period for social identity formation. It is when you figure out who you are outside your family, when you build the friendships that last decades, when you attempt connection, fail at it, recover, and slowly learn what it actually costs. A 2021 study in JAMA Network Open found that young adults in this exact bracket showed the highest rates of depression and anxiety during pandemic lockdowns compared to every other demographic, including the elderly. They weren't simply isolated. They were isolated during the years that were supposed to write the social architecture of the rest of their lives. What researchers observed in the aftermath wasn't the expected pattern. Not men who came back damaged and tried to rebuild. Something quieter. Young men who had simply never built the social infrastructure to begin with, and who, once the external pressure to engage was removed, found no particular internal reason to reconstruct it. Psychologists began using the term social atrophy. Not depression in the clinical sense, though depression was often present. A process closer to what happens to a muscle that stops being used. It doesn't break, it doesn't hurt, it simply weakens through disuse. And, crucially, the disuse starts to feel comfortable, then normal, then preferable. Every time a social obligation gets avoided, the brain registers a small reward. No awkwardness, no performance, no risk of rejection. That reward loop calcifies into a default. The outside world stops feeling like something to participate in and starts feeling like something to observe from a safe distance on your own terms. There's a name for the life that fills the space left by that withdrawal. Parasocial. The connection you feel toward a streamer, a podcaster, a creator who has no awareness that you exist. It isn't fake in the way people dismiss it. The warmth is neurologically real. Research on parasocial attachment shows it activates the same circuits as genuine social belonging, which is precisely why it's so effective at quieting the hunger for connection without ever actually feeding it. You could spend 1,000 hours with someone's voice in your ears and still go months without a conversation where someone is listening back. Here's what the psychology actually says about why this happened to this generation of men specifically. Previous generations had external structures that organized male social life by default. Physical work sites, military service, religious institutions, neighborhood bars, sports leagues that required showing up on a specific day at a specific time. These weren't perfect, but they functioned as mandatory social architecture. You were placed in a room with other men, and the room said, "This is where you are." Connection happened through friction, through shared physical presence, not through a conscious daily choice to engage. For early Gen Z men, those structures collapsed or went optional at exactly the wrong moment. Remote school, remote work, streaming sports, digital church. Every institution that once required physical attendance had an opt-out now. And for a generation already predisposed by years of adolescent social media exposure, to prefer the controlled environment of a screen over the unpredictability of a room full of people, the removal of mandatory social architecture wasn't freedom. It was an invitation to disappear without anyone noticing. For early Gen Z men who watched older millennials follow the prescribed path and still arrive at 30 with debt, underemployment, and burnout, the participation contract looked broken before they ever had a chance to sign it. What the withdrawal actually says, read carefully, is, I watched the rules get made. I watched people follow them. I saw what it cost, and I decided the odds weren't worth it. That isn't apathy. That is a risk calculation made by people who learned, earlier than they should have, that the world doesn't automatically reward showing up. Now here's what I need to say directly to you. If any of this landed somewhere specific, if you recognize yourself in the slow subtraction, in the muted chats, in the parasocial connections that feel safer than real ones, in the door you closed and haven't found a reason to reopen, hear this clearly. Understanding why it happened is not the same as being defined by it. Social atrophy is real, but atrophy reverses. Every study on men who rebuilt social lives after extended withdrawal points to the same place. Not a grand reentry, not a single dramatic decision. One low-stakes act of physical presence with repetition built in. A gym at the same time every morning, a class with the same faces each week. Any structure that put them in a room with people who expected them to show up. Not because those things are magic, because friction, the kind you cannot manufacture through a screen, is the only mechanism that interrupts the atrophy loop. There's a version of you that existed before the algorithm knew your name, Before the group chat went silent. Before the world gave you enough reasons to calculate that staying in was the rational move. That version didn't withdraw because he was broken. He withdrew because the architecture failed him at exactly the wrong moment, and no one named it while it was happening. The architecture can be rebuilt, one uncomfortable Tuesday at a time. If this gave language to something you've been carrying, say in the comments, not for me, but because naming it is usually what interrupts the loop. And if you know someone this video is about, send it without explanation. Sometimes that's the whole conversation. Like this if it landed somewhere real. I'll see you in the next one.